and welcome to another episode of Brand Retro. Today we have Mallory Dean, who's a digital designer and UX specialist, and to be honest, has a pretty respectable amount of content out there that you might want to check out when all this is over. So Mallory, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here.
Could you start by telling us a little bit about your career and kind of how you got to be where you're at? I'd just like to learn a little bit more about your backstory.
Sure. Well, I started off as a graphic designer. I went to school for graphic design, visual design mostly. I've kind of worked at a variety, I guess, different environments. I started off like way back in college interning at a pretty big software and analytics company called SAS. That was a very interesting introduction into working as a designer. I worked within the marketing department, mostly creating PowerPoints. So like my first design job out of college and kind of transitioning as an intern was making PowerPoints for like marketing executives. Although like I didn't love the design part of it, it was such an interesting experience to kind of learn how to collaborate with others, and an introduction into working with like other disciplines. So that was really my first kind of stepping stone. And then after that, I've worked at a variety of agencies. I've worked within insurance, in healthcare, hospice, bunch of different industries, mostly doing print work for a while. And I actually decided I did not like print work as much as I was interested in moving into product design, UX, and more digital work. So I went back to school for about a year and took a certificate in UX design to really just like get a foundation and a better way to like transition into doing more digital design. Today, I am working at an agency called Instrument. They're out of Portland and New York City, but I work remote, and we do really awesome, mostly product design work, but some content design too, and a little bit of like marketing design as well. It's really great because I get to touch a little bit of kind of the intersection of brand and product design, which I really love. But yeah, up until now, I've been basically kind of jumping through agencies, seeing what I like, exploring all the different types of design.
That's pretty interesting. Our paths are very similar in that I started off doing like the illustration graphic design work, ended up in the printing industry, went back to school for, mine was more IT marketing with the goal of web development. So very, very similar. And I find it interesting too that, in the graphic design world, we don't, as graphic designers, I don't think we aspire to necessarily be in print. I mean, at least most of us don't. We don't aspire to maybe work for insurance companies or stuff like that. But getting that experience and even being in the printing industry, designing PowerPoints, designing some of that, I would say, lesser ideal stuff, in my opinion, really helps you see different perspectives. It helps you troubleshoot. It helps you kind of hone your skills so that by the time you start working on the stuff you do want to work on, you're pretty proficient in a lot of different areas. So that's a pretty solid background. I just wanted to mention that because I think it's worth mentioning that, as designers, sometimes we got to make the best out of a situation, and that's a pretty solid, robust background. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true. And I think with any type of design, I have people come to me and they say, oh, I want to transition from, I guess, graphic design to service design or UX. And they're like, do you think it's doable? I'm like, of course. I think transitioning in design in general, it's always going to be pretty easy once you kind of like get the foundations, because all of design has the same principles. And I actually part-time worked for an interior designer for about 3 years. I would help out with actually like going on site, as well as like I did their presentations and mood boards because they really needed help with that. But the same principles I found, even in interior design, when you think like it's a little bit removed, it's really not that removed. It's still colors and textures and how things are laid out. It's the same principles. So I definitely think, no matter where you can start, you got to learn that foundations, and learning how to work with other disciplines is huge. And that's something I definitely found even in those like less desirable jobs I've had in the past, but it's all led to like being a better designer.
Yeah. I mean, because to be honest, you're going to get thrown those curveballs throughout your career, and having worked through them at some point kind of helps you then not only be more proficient for the long haul, but it helps you kind of be ready for those curveballs. I don't suggest it, but like we get asked to design stuff in PowerPoint and Word. And again, not ideal, not where I would suggest doing it. But sometimes if it is what it is and that's where you have to do it, then you have to learn how to design within the confines and limitations of those platforms. Yeah. And it's something you want to know, because you obviously you want to help the customer out, but you also want to use your skills to put forth some level of expectation or some level of standard of what that design needs to be. And a lot of those tools aren't built for that. So to work through that process and identify the workarounds so that when asked to do it, you're capable of it is huge. Let's transition a little bit. I went through some of your content, was checking out your website. Great stuff, by the way. I want to talk about the 5 whys, because I think a lot of what you're doing, I mean, it's design work, so there's that. But there's also an educational piece, and I feel like you're putting a lot of that stuff out there. You're sharing it, to be consumed by other creatives, other designers, potential, marketing professionals and whatnot. So I wanted to talk through the 5 whys and just kind of go through the steps with you, because I thought that was it was a nice piece of content, and I think it's important for everybody to, whether they have their own version of it or not, to have some kind of a process very similar to what you laid out in your content. So the idea behind the 5 whys, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'll have you jump in on this, but the idea behind the 5 whys is to basically take a step back from a potential problem or an issue that you're trying to solve. And it's to methodically identify who the players are, what the problem is, what are the steps to resolving that problem. So just to kind of take a step back before everybody jumping in or not necessarily getting the collective input of the people involved or the people that are tethered to said project, correct?
Yeah, definitely. I think especially when you're starting a project with a bunch of people, like the reason why you need to take a step back is because everyone, especially if you're working with a new client and there's a bunch of stakeholders at different levels too, there's you want to bring in a bunch of different levels of employees, and I think everyone comes with like their perspective and their views on the problems, and that's really difficult, because when you're hired and you're like going in to help solve a problem that the client has, everyone has a different view on what the problem is. And I think that's the key thing here is like, we need to get everyone to take a step back because they're too close to it. And that's like the biggest problem I find when designing and when working on projects with clients, is that they're too close to it. And it's like, it could be the simplest change, but they couldn't see it. And that's why, exercises like the 5 whys or just, those type of workshops really help.
Yeah. So Mallory, we only do the audio on the podcast at the moment, so you just nod or shake your head if you agree with this. What Mallory just described was a very PC and very nice approach. What she's really saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, but what she's really saying is a lot of times we get, as designers, as creatives, as web developers, whatever it is, we get thrown these projects, we get thrown these challenges from the people above us, from other departments in the company. And 9 times out of 10, there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And there's also too many people involved in the project who don't actually know what it takes to execute said project. So what needs to happen is, yes, we need that input from those people, because obviously we know that they have a request, right? They want something done. But then we have to take that request, bring in the people who actually know what they're talking about and actually know different aspects of the project that can resolve said project. And then we have to get realistic about what we can or can't do. And to some degree, manage expectation and manage the fact that, again, we have too many cooks in the kitchen. Yeah. So from an insider, from a designer, from a creative standpoint, it's not to knock the process, but it's the reality of it. When we get asked to do things, sometimes it's like, that's honestly the way you're describing it's not even possible, but let me tell you what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? I'm just going to be blunt with it because you were very nice about it. I'm like, no, this is what it really is. And it's not to, it's not, again, not to knock the process or to be frustrated with it. It's just the reality. So when we pull those people together, we got to get realistic about what's possible.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody wants, I guess, I mean, I think people are just like selfish because when they're working on like everyone comes in and they have their own priorities a lot of the time, and getting them to line up is the hardest thing. Sometimes I found that, it can take a week just to hear back from clients on they're still deciding what they want to do. They're still deciding. And that's the biggest problem is, yeah, there's too many cooks in the kitchen. You got to step back and say, what can we realistically get done here? And, we're not going to be able to hit everybody's priorities, but I guess what is the top priority we need to hit? And exactly what you said. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. And one more thing to add there is sometimes the budget doesn't match the expectation.
Yeah.
Not to get into my war stories, but that used to happen to me a lot with, in my previous life, is we would always look at brands like Target or Nike, and we would just say, well, easy, just replicate that. And it's like, okay, but to replicate that takes 6 figures. It takes 9 months. It takes whatever it is, like to simply just say, oh, just copy what they did is a lot bigger ask than most people realize. And sometimes, honestly, sometimes it's not even doable based off the timeframes or the budgets. So I just wanted to put a little context as to why the 5 whys and where the 5 whys kicks in, because I think to help manage people, expectations, opinions, requests, it's huge. So we'll jump right into step 1, gathering the stakeholders. Tell us a little bit about that process.
Yeah. Well, I think once again, when you're starting off, you're kicking off the project, you really want those key people in the room. And because they're the decision makers, and they're in the end the people who you're serving, and you need to hear their history and kind of their experience with the product and what's failed and what's been successful in the past. And I think without having those people in the room, or just even like chatting with them for like 15 minutes, it's going to be really hard to kind of understand what you can get done and what's successful for them.
Yeah, it's important too, just to get everybody on the same page with what the problem or the scope or the realistic solution might be. I can tell you, having answered to different boards within corporations, sometimes that step, that getting the stakeholders together, provides so much clarity to the expectation that the expectation changes. Mm-hmm. That they take a step back and they say, wow, I didn't realize it was going to be that complex, or it takes that much time, or whatever. And now my expectations change. Let's do this instead. And it doesn't always have to change the expectation, but again, I think calibrating and getting that realistic discussion out of the way with those people who make the decisions up front is huge.
Yeah. And one thing to note is that like it can be really hard to get those people to sit down with you. I mean, a lot of times it's the people who have the busiest schedules, or I mean, I guess they just don't feel like they want to make time for you. Sadly enough, they think other things are more important sometimes than design, marketing. It is important. It's also important to start off the project meeting with them, because if you wait too long and you create a bunch of content, you get too far into the project with what other people think needs to be done and what other people think are the solutions, and then you go and present the work, it could be totally off. I think that's what's really important about getting those people, if you can, right up front and talking with them. And also sometimes you find out that those aren't the right people you should be talking to. So it's just a bunch of things, but like that initial communication is really helpful.
Yeah. And one thing to add there, I think that, like you said, a lot of times those upper level stakeholders kind of feel like, well, I don't have time for that.
Mm-hmm.
Or, maybe you're the expert, you tell me, kind of a thing. But the reality is as one of those people in the trenches, as the creative, as the designer, as the web developer, whatever your role you're playing, it is very important to get the at least understanding with the people above so that the expectations align.
Yeah.
Because if the person above or the person casting out that project, if they're just throwing it out there, to like throwing the project at Mallory in this example and saying, I don't know, you figure it out. Well, then you're making the assumption that I'm able to deliver according to your expectations. And if your expectations are off or inaccurate or whatever, then you're doomed to fail.
Yeah.
So getting them in there for at least that initial sign off, or at least the initial meeting, so that they can walk away knowing it's not as easy as they think.
Mm-hmm.
Even that's a victory, but it's getting them in that room to understand what the first steps are.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to step 2, is defining the problem. And this is a big part of it, because the problem is different depending on who you ask.
Yep. Yeah.
So what's your process, or what do you suggest? Kind of, how do you attack that?
Well, that is very tricky. I think having that initial conversation is going to help, and going away with that and really sinking into all the notes. And it's best to even, I guess, workshop directly with them, and defining the problem can take some time. And I think that's why the 5 whys helps, is because you continuously ask questions. So I guess my way of tackling it is just ask a ton of questions. You can't have a big ego. You can't come in and think you know everything. You're there because, you would hope that they're the experts in whatever field that you're going in to help with them. So I think asking questions is the key to at least unlocking some further problem or some way of thinking to lead you to defining that. And it's going to change. Defining the problem, I don't know if I even like the word defining, because it is something that can change. I think, let's start off with something and let's keep pushing it. But, things change. Pivots happen all the time. So, if we start to work on something and we realize, wait, no, there's an even bigger problem at hand here. For example, recently we were working on a project and designing just like key checkout screens, right? Or just something simple like that. And there was a bigger problem of like, we don't like this color scheme. And it's like, wait a second, you're not going to pay attention to these detailed screens because you don't like the color scheme at all. So it's just like, there's a big shift there where you're like, maybe there's a different problem here. Maybe you just don't like your branding, or maybe, you haven't invested into that. So it's like, pivots happen all the time. I think just defining the problem can be a starting off point, and asking questions, I think, is where I would start.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great step in flushing out what we're even talking about, right? Like, what's the urgency? What's the problem? What are we trying to figure out? And just having that discussion to start flushing those details out. But I would also say, whether it's identifying 5, 10, 20, however many problems that you can attach or associate to this, said project, you have to prioritize them, and you have to truly evaluate whether or not is it really a problem? Mm-hmm. Is it a need, or is it a want, or is it like, what is it? Because that changes everything. A lot of times, you've done this, I'm sure 1,000 times as well, but when you're doing projects, website projects, or trying to solve creative issues, sometimes you'll solve one and five other problems will go with it, and you've just knocked 3, 4, 5 things off the list.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're so separate, they're completely different issues, but because they all fall within a certain category, the belief is, well, aren't they the same thing? No, they're totally different. This one takes 10 minutes and this one takes 10 weeks. Mm-hmm. it's apples and bowling balls. So you have to be able to identify those problems, but then really assess the ranking or the priority of those
Yeah,
problems.
completely.
So step 3 is kind of working through the whys. So again, you've brought the stakeholders in. That's step 1. Step 2 is you've asked those questions. You've identified what you believe to be those problems. Perhaps you ranked them. You have some kind of a working list of issues that you now want to attack. So step 3 is you start working through them. How does that go? Is it a process of delegation? Is it a process of, how do you start that process?
Sure. I think when it comes to asking the whys, you really, the key point here is, I think sometimes the problems are surface level a little bit, and you really just need to dig deeper. And I think the process of asking it doesn't have to be formal. I don't know if you need to go into the actual meeting or workshop and say, let's do the 5 whys. I think a lot of times it just comes out naturally to to dig deeper and to get them really thinking. Like you mentioned earlier, clients saying, let's just do what Target did. Okay, why? Like, why do you like what they did? And then they say something like, oh, we love I guess the style of the commercial or whatever. Okay, what did you like about that style? What didn't you like about it? And so it's like they come with some, even if it's not a problem, they come with something they like, they come with something they don't like. Asking those whys continuously, they don't even realize you're doing it sometimes, but it's just like helping them get to the answer. They know it's deep down, like, it's deep down, like why they really like something, why there is an issue, why they want to go a certain direction, but they just haven't been able to articulate it.
Yeah, and this is a ridiculous example, but it's a real example. I've had it be like something like the conversation starts with, we need to look at our checkout process. It's all jacked up.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, is it not working? Well, it's working fine, but this is this and this is that. And just look at Target. That's what I want. Or look at whoever. That's what I'm shooting for. Oh, okay. Well, if we do this, and by the time I start asking those questions and working them down the list, they just want the button red.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like literally, like we started off as, we need to blow this thing up and start over. And 15 minutes later, it's like, yeah, I want the button red. Okay, well, that's a totally different request, and a very easy one. We should have started there. But it took us a while to get there because, for whatever reason, we have different perceptions of how this stuff works and even the process. And sometimes we don't even pick up on the similarities of what we have versus what we want.
Yeah. And I think it's also because, as designers, as creators, we're really good at picking up those details. People removed from it aren't. They don't know why they like something. They don't know why they want to change something. And that's fair. I mean, there's plenty of times in general where I'm like, something feels off. I just don't know why. And then someone could come in and be that person for me. But I think that's what we need to be for them, is like that detective. It's like just really, helping them arrive to what the key problem here is. And sometimes, yeah, it isn't a problem. It's just they don't like the color of the button.
Yeah. I mean, it's scary how often it happens. But it is very important to be able to tear those questions down and get to the real issue, which sometimes, it's the button's the wrong color, which is fine. But, sometimes it just takes a little bit to get there.
Yeah. And the good thing about that is that, like, it helps with prioritization. Like you said, if you just ask a few more questions, if you ask why a few more times, and first you thought it was this huge problem, and you realize, oh, it's just a half-day thing, or not even that, then you can move on to maybe tackling other problems or really trying to get those higher priorities.
Which actually is a good segue into step 4, because I think it's going to come down. Step 4 is basically making actionable step towards fixing the root cause, which, we have to identify the issues. We have to decide what actions need to go into resolving those issues. But now there's time frames. You got to figure out how long it's going to take, who's going to do it, all those kinds of things. So how do you suggest approaching that process, and how do you suggest approaching it with a large team versus a small team versus contractors?
Sure. I think when it comes to making action, well, the good thing is you've done a lot of talking at this point. You've uncovered a lot of insights, and if you can at least have a note taker in the room, that's going to be so helpful in figuring out, what the first steps are. And I guess even if you don't know yet, then those notes can help you do some additional research. I When it comes to larger teams, I think it just depends on what type of project it is. I always find that the best thing is really just continue workshopping within the team. I'm a really big fan of working together. Just more brains sometimes are better than one. And if everyone's at that initial meeting, you may have forgotten something, but someone else may have picked up on something. Yeah. And I think it's really just like taking your notes, writing them down as like actionable steps. I work with strategists purely that just help like do that brief back where they like write down all of the insights we got and some previous research we may have gotten, and they help us form those actionable starting points and even bring in some benchmarking and look at what other people are doing and see if you can bring some of those ideas. But I honestly think the best place to start is to just debrief, kind of. It doesn't have to be formal, but maybe you do kind of break it down into, I guess, those starting points into like a little slide, a PowerPoint slide if you have to, or just like a Word doc, and say, this is where we can start, and then go forward with it. And even bringing those back to the client can also be great to get clarity on if this is actually the right direction. We've done all this work to uncover, what the problem is, why we think it's a problem. Now we're going to go back and say what we think the correct direction is, and bring that to the client and say, do you think this is a good route to go down? They could say still, nope, it's still wrong, before actually like starting designing. It might be still worth it to get that one more additional piece of alignment.
You don't want to get swept up in the process and miss the point of how all this started,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, you want to take the opportunity to explain to them how these steps build up or basically support that original problem that they brought you to. Because a lot of times, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong or if you have a different opinion on this, but a lot of times they think the one problem equals one solution. And sometimes one problem, there's 5 solutions that need to go into the one problem because it's more complex than they believe.
Exactly. Yeah, that happens a lot. Sometimes it opens a can of worms that you didn't actually want to go down, but you have to bring it up and say, we've explored a bit, and we've done some research and started to brainstorm, and this may lead us down a few different paths. And you can either bring wireframes to them in the initial like reviews, or you can just like have another chat with them and say, is this the right direction? And if so, then yes, let's move forward with this.
Mallory, what's the 5th why for you? I know you can have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 whys. It just depends on the project, the team, the situation. But typically, what do you find that 5th why to be? And where do you, I know questions are great, so this is I'm kind of asking a trick question to some degree, but when is too many whys a problem?
That is really tricky, because the problem with asking too many whys is that you can get too granular of steps, and you get to that point where it's like you're freaking out over the color of an icon, and it's like, we need to step back again. Is this important? Is this too detailed? Now we're too far removed. We're too from what we original plan was. It really just depends on how deep the person you're talking to can get in those first few. I have no real solution, no answer to that. How many is too many whys? I think it just depends on the person you're talking to, but also like you got to make sure that you're not going too deep into it and too far from the original standpoint. And if you do, you might need to like, I guess, start over and realize maybe once again this is another issue. But make sure to not get too far removed or too deep into something that's just not important
or maybe not relevant today.
Yeah.
Tell me if you agree or disagree, but you kind of went where I hoped you would, in that we all have high expectations, and I personally have as high of expectations as anybody else, but I also, to your point, I have to take a step back and I have to assess what's realistic and what's, maybe aligning with where we're at today in the process. Do we really have the answers to the questions we keep asking? And if we don't, what's our option? Do we just wait till we have those answers, or do we push forth with what we do know, make the best of that, and then reassess and calibrate later? An example of this is I have clients that, maybe, I don't want to say their expectations are too high, because I think that's great that they have high expectations, but I think their vision in their mind is maybe like a 5-year vision.
Yeah.
And in year one, they're actually getting in their own way with approvals. They're getting in their own way with pushing the work out. And in some ways, they're actually hurting the momentum and the growth of their own business, because they want it to be that 5-year vision. And I have to come to them and kind of do like you said. I have to take that step back and say, we're working towards that, but here's all the reasons why it can't be that today. And at some point, we have to put a fork in it so that we can move the ball forward slowly and progress towards that 5-year vision. Because if not, then we're going to sit at idle, or we're going to sit unlaunched. If it's a website, we're going to hold everything up, which then makes that 5-year vision impossible.
Exactly.
So we have to put rubber to the road and make sure that we're kind of managing our expectations with what's realistic, in alignment with what that big goal is. And that's hard sometimes for clients, because they want that end result now. And as we all know, it just sometimes doesn't work that way.
And it is about trust too. I mean, they're scared to trust us to move it along. And I think if you can show up and you bring those key people in, and you just talk to them, and you really get to know them, and you really do that work, then you can start to move it forward, and you can get to the point where you can say, all right, we got to start. We can talk all day about our vision and maybe what we want, but eventually, like, we got a time frame, and we got to move it along. So I think a big thing is trust. Do they trust us to listen and do the work to help them create solutions that they're looking for?
Yeah. And not to get off on that rabbit trail, but you're 100% right. It's a lot about trust. And again, give me your opinion on this, but for anybody listening, whether it's a client or, anybody, a marketing professional that would work with people like Mallory or myself, just know that, like, there's two sides to these projects. There's the people behind the scenes whose work doesn't get seen. And if anybody was going to not care, it would probably be them. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying it might be them. But for us creatives who are on the front end of this thing, and our work's getting seen, and it's important to us because it feeds our portfolio, because we're proud of our work, because we're the last ones that are going to try to lead you astray.
Yeah.
Like, we're actually putting our work out there for everybody to see. It's so, I mean, we're in such a vulnerable spot with these projects and these clients. I can promise you that, I mean, I can't speak for everybody in the world, but I can promise you that 99+% of all creatives, all designers, we're all trying to lead you down the right road, because why would we do that to ourselves? We're invested in these projects as you are to some degree, because it's our work. It's our showpiece, so to speak, and our legacy that we're trying to build out. So trust is huge. And trust is a very difficult thing sometimes, but when you're working with a designer and working with a team of creatives like this, there's got to be a discussion or at least some understanding of where that trust level's at.
Yeah, and if they don't bring that trust, then maybe that comes into not doing the best work. You might grow some resentment. You might just, after a while, like if they come back and they don't show that trust, if they're not, I guess just helpful in the process, that they're not even answering your emails or just showing up for the partnership, does, make the work suffer a bit. And I do think, if you can just like have that initial trust, you're going to get to the solution. Even if you come to the first meeting and you're like presenting ideas and they don't like it, or they're disappointed, maybe have that trust to be like, okay, well, we didn't get it right this time. Can we try again? And I think, it's definitely possible. So I think it's scary. It's scary for clients or anybody who's investing in marketing and design to take that investment. But it's also scary for us because we want to do the best work we can. So yeah, there's a lot of fear. But I guess, trust is the only way you're going to have a good relationship with each other and create good work.
Yeah. Again, I don't think this issue is going anywhere, but since you brought it up, I think it's important to say, and so that clients and people can hear that, is that it is super important, because that trust can make or break the project, and it can actually hurt the end result. Mm-hmm. I mean, not that you won't still end up with a good end result, but if you put a little faith in that person giving you the recommendation and follow their lead just to some degree, you're going to see that creativity and that ability to work with what you're giving them and make it better is that much greater.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Mallory, thank you so much for joining. It was great to meet you. B, I think, talking through the whys was fantastic. And the trust thing rolls up in that. I really appreciate you coming on and having that chat with me.
Yeah, it was great to meet you too. And I love talking about design process and just all the different ways we can, make work a bit easier for ourselves. So.
All right. If you guys want to check out Mallory, MalloryDean.com, and then she's got, different channels she's on with TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Dribble. She's in a couple different places sharing content about UX design, creative process, all those kinds of good things. So check her out. She's awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
If you'd like to learn more about the CyberDogs experience, check us out online at cyberdogsmarketing.com for updated blogs, new podcast episodes, examples of previous work, and the brands we have and are currently working with, and much, much more.